We're on page 456 in John T. Christensen's History of the Baptist, and not 456. We're on page 323. The settlement in Alabama. Now we're going into all these countries, the states here, the territories where Baptists were going. They're going in for religious freedom. Either the Catholics were beating them over the head, or the Church of England was beating them over the head, or the Presbyterians, or the Pilgrims. All of these persecuted other people. And the Baptists, wherever they went, they just preached the Word of God, and that's that. And they made converts. The settlement in Alabama was a comparative late date. Perhaps Hosea Holcomb gives the best account of the rise of the Baptists in that state. He's at the northern part of the country, the northern part of the state, north of Tennessee River, particularly the Madison County, which is a beautiful, fertile country, was settled many years before any other part of the state, except a small section on the Tombigbee River about St. Stephen's. In the first settling in Madison County, there were some Baptists. Elder John Nicholson, who became pastor of the first church constituted in Madison County, and John Canterbury and Zadok Baker were, as we learn, among the Baptist ministers who labored in the wilderness. And this was all wilderness, remember. They were driven into the wilderness. The beauty of the country, the fertility of soil, the excellent springs of water, combined with many other advantages, soon drew a dense population into the region. It was good country. And in the course of a few years, a number of Baptist churches were formed. Worldly inducements brought a number of ministers into this region, some of whom died a short time and others removed. And although there were those who stood high in the estimation of the people, yet, as we have mentioned in the history of the Flint River Association, it appears that they labored in vain. They labored in vain. The hearts of the preachers and the people were fixed too much on fleeting things of time and space and sense. It was easy to accumulate wealth, and professors of religion as well as others gave themselves up to the flattering prospects of gain. Elders Shackelford, Edens, and Bennett and Wood were among the early ministers in this country whose names will live long in the recollections of many. Others settled about the same time, among whom Jeremiah Tucker and George Tucker and John Smith and J.C. Latta and J. Thompson, all of whom have since died and left the country. About the year 1808, now we're back up to 1800 now. Earlier, some Baptists were found in the southern part near the Tombigbee River in Clark and Washington counties. William Cochran, a licensed preacher from Georgia, is said to have been the first in Clark County, and Mr. Gorman, who died in a short time, the first in Washington County. You have to realize now they were going into this country where if you were injured or something, you could get disease, infection and everything, and a lot of times, in just working hard, you were injured and you died from that injury. The last named county lies on the west side of the river, Clark on the east. In the latter, a church was organized in 1810 by Elder J. Courtney, Elder Joseph McGee, and was highly esteemed as a minister of Christ, and settled here. And shortly after, there was no great increase in Baptists in this country until after Jackson Purchase was made. In 1815 and 1816, the tide of immigration began to flow into Indian country. And on up until 1820 and after, there was still a continual flow pouring in from every state of the Union into this area. From the Tennessee River to Florida, and from the Coso to the Tombigbee, there was scarcely a spot but what was visited by immigrants and who wished to be such. Churches were formed in almost every part of the state, and a number of laborious and indefatigable ministers of the gospel came in and settled this country. Houses for the worship of God were scarce for several years. After the writer came to this country in 1818, and many of those were erected were more like Indian wigwams than anything else. Only they were open and uncomfortable. It was common in those days, when the weather was favorable, for the minister to take his stand under some convenient shady tree, while the people would set themselves around on the ground and soak up the chiggers and ticks in this country, pretty much. In many instances, large congregations would assemble. They were far more attentive to the word than they were at the time in many comfortable places, as in some instances a hard shower of rain would disperse them, or lightning storms. The first camp meeting, says he, perhaps ever known in Alabama, was held with a church where the writer has his membership, the writer of this. This meeting took place about the 1st of October in 1831. Isn't that something to read people's writings that they, back in now we're in 1831? My great-great-great-grandfather was born in 1809, so he was alive when this took place. It continued for 5 or 6 days, and 12 or 15 families tented on the ground. Here the Lord made bare his arm and displayed his power and the salvation of many precious souls. The groans and the cries of repenting sinners and the songs and prayers and the shouts and the praise of Christians formed an awful and yet delightful harmony. At this meeting there commenced the greatest general revival ever known at this time in Middle Alabama, and it continued for 12 months, during which period there were near 500 baptized in the cold winter of 1831-32, during which over 150 were baptized. And from that time, camp meetings become common among the Baptists in different parts of the state, and yet some churches disapproved of the course. They did not like this hyper-evangelism. And there were some very emotional things going on here. There were extravagances in some of these meetings, a little more emotional than what should have been. We think that few will deny, yet there was much good done. It was not unusual to have a large portion of the congregation prostrated on the ground, and in some instances they appeared to have lost the use of their limbs. No distinct articulation could be heard. Screams and cries and shouts and notes of grief and notes of joy all heard at the same time, with much confusion. A sort of indescribable concert. At associations and other great meetings there were several ministers present. Many of them would exercise their gifts at the same time in different parts of the congregation, and some exhortation, others in prayer for the distressed, and others again in argument with opposers. A number of the preachers did not approve of this kind of work. This is getting into the charismatic movement today, is what it actually is. This is a pre-charismatic movement, and we're going to find out that it was not so much among Baptists, but Presbyterians and Methodists. The fire-baptized Methodists were what they were called at this time, the fire-baptized Methodists and Presbyterians. When winnowing time came on, it was clearly demonstrated that there was much good wheat, notwithstanding there was considerable quantity of chaff also. Chapter 3, page 326. The story of the Spanish occupation of America is romantic and cruel. Spain at that time of the discovery of this country dominated by blind religious fanaticism, the expression of which is called the Inquisition. The Inquisition is where they tortured people and called them witches. And most of these witches were Baptist. And they burned them at the stake. They went through all of Europe. And we have with this Inquisition, we have them going into what we call the Holy Land and killing everybody in sight. This was a very hard time, and they did it all in the name of Christ. The very year, 1492, that Columbus discovered America, the Inquisition in Spain had done its fiercest work. Isabella afterwards expressed herself as follows: "For the love of Christ and the Virgin Mother, I have caused great misery, and have depopulated towns and districts and provinces and kingdoms." Depopulated them. That means murder. The discovery of America by Columbus, says Goodspeed, opened Spain and opportunities such as never again fell to the lot of the ignorant and expired nation. Spain came over here and they enslaved the American Indians. And they went into Mexico, they went in South America, Mount Potosi down there. Now, let me tell you a little history as we're going through this. About this period of time, China had the largest navy in the world. And they would go from continent to continent and just look at the people and said, there's nothing there among these filthy people we want. But, strong adversity of conjunction, but one thing that China needed was silver and gold. Silver and gold would stabilize their economy. So China, even though they looked down upon all other nations as ignorant savages, they began to trade with the Spanish Catholics in South America, and there's where we have all of this gold and silver. I have a silver piece of 8 that I got from Marilyn for her birthday, and it goes way back to this period of time, way back there. And a piece of 8 is 8/10 of an ounce of gold. And they would go in here and they would ship these ships, and now we have the Spanish armadas, and we have the ships that are loaded with gold and silver going back to Spain, and the Catholic Church is very rich at this time now, very rich. And they began to trade with China, and that's where noodles, you know, the noodles, spaghetti didn't begin in Italy, it began in China. And here we have the China migration of foods and whatever, and from America we have the migration of foods in America to China and all the rest of the world. The beans, the squash, the potatoes, all of these things that were going into these different countries. We'll call this Columbian exchange. And America, what did America get it for? They were enslaved by Catholicism all up and down the coast. The people were. And disease, tremendous disease. In Europe, the Catholic Church had disbanded the leper colonies, and many of the people in the leper colonies didn't actually have leprosy but had syphilis. And these Spanish soldiers would go in there and rape all these women, and they weren't really badly affected, but they gave them syphilis. And this is a syphilis that your lips would fall off, your nose, your fingers and everything. It was a terrible thing like leprosy. And they brought it to America. And they spread it all over the world. That was when a great leprosy plague. They called the syphilis leprosy plague. Now all of this is taking place in the background, okay? This is what's going on in the world, in the background. She had passed the summit of her glory and sanctioned the barbarous and innumerable conquests that had witnessed the moth-like delight of her fawning nobles. But with fascious blindness, who wholly disregarded the call of the scythe and the grateful peons of the plow, her civilization had sprung from the gospel of the Inquisition, and from the creak of the rack, and from the expulsion of learning, and from death, chance, and burning heretics, from the nightmare of distorted, brutal, and barbarous Christianity. And the Catholic Church, when it came to America, enslaved these people, beat these children, took their language away from them, put Spanish in place of it. It was hard to convert an Indian ever after that. Even when America went into the Indian nations and they set up Presbyterian and they set up Catholic schools, the children were beaten. Many, which we know today, even in Canada and all over in those places, the women were raped, the little girls were raped, all of this what took place in these areas, and the graveyards were full. The education of the little tree. There's a movie out there that tells you a little bit about that. The husbandman and his family were classed with the swine and the root in the ground. He was kicked, cowed, cursed, robbed by the court and church, by the state and supremacy. The glory of Spain had become the exile and degradation of labor and enthronement of deification of caste and ignorance and priestcraft. The blasting stupidity of the priests perverted the religion established by the Almighty and proclaimed to all mankind by Jesus of Nazareth. The priestly orders gave their consent to murder's conquest, crime for gold, and the unprincipled splendors of the church and state, the wealth of the nation in rippling fields of grain and homes of intelligent and happy children, the reign of liberties, beneficent laws, and nobility of labor, and the piety of perpetual peace were undreamed of and unknown in the swaggering grandest, who thronged the fair Spanish cities and jeered at the labor rooting in the adjacent soil. A nation that took delight in the hideous spectacle of the Spanish bullfights and the chicken fights could not be expected to emblazon kindness on its bloody banner. Blood and guts, blood and guts. Torture, blood and guts. A people who regarded all persons other than Catholics as heretics, fit only for the rack and the stake, found an easy excuse for the deliberate slaughter of the Indian heretics in the New World. Enslavement or death. In California, all the way from San Diego up to Oregon, all of those cities, what they called El Camino Real, were nothing but slave plantations. Most of the Indians in California at least have a lot of Spanish blood in them, because only the priest procreated with the girls. Their husbands many times were neutered. They were sent out in California, and we're going back to this period of time now. They would take the Indian slaves and make slaves of them, and California was absolutely abundant with grizzly bears. The largest grizzly bears in the United States were in California, the great grizzly. 2,500-pound grizzlies, if you can even imagine that. 2,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds. You know, we talk about the Kodiak bears and everything. The California grizzly and the Kodiak bear were cousins, so to speak. That's the only, and all the California grizzlies are gone. The last one was killed in Fresno, California, or near Fresno, California in 1920-something. Why they didn't keep some in a zoo or something someplace, I do not know. But the Catholic Church forced those Indians to go out with spears and arrows and kill these giant grizzlies, which the Indians considered somewhat sacred. How many Indians died slaying these beasts? There were thousands of bear hides sent out from San Miguel, Santa Barbara, and all through those missions over there on the coast. Thousands of grizzlies every month. They wanted these skins in Europe. And it took lives of these Indian slaves every time one grizzly hide there, probably an Indian died, or maybe two died in the process of obtaining that hide. Or last, in the early 1900s, they found the last man, Ishi. All of these people they hunted Indians in California like big game, and his family had been hunted. In the name of God and Jesus, Mary, the glittering Toledo blades of De Soto's grandees and the Coronados cavaliers drank the blood of the natives with such sanction of the priest, just as the Inquisition destroyed other believers in Old Spain. The religion of the Castile and to Aragon with the murder of heretics and the murderous conquest of the Spanish colonial policy. That's how Baptists went behind these people and trying to reach these Indians with the gospel. They didn't understand anything but blood and thirst and greed. So the golden opportunity of adding to this miserable civilization a splendid realm of domestic happiness and industrial wealth was wholly unappreciated by the priests and the nobility who dominated the Spanish court. She passed blunderingly by a magnificent empire which later shone in the west like a star, inviting wise men in the east to come here to worship at the shrine of domestic happiness and just Christianity. But her wise men were wanting. They had overridden their camels of conquest and were lost in the desert of their own crimes. She was doomed to decadence from the inherited evil festering in her own cruel and ignorant heart. We're talking about Catholicism. The history of the province of Louisiana under France and Spain and the territories of the states of the United States formed therefrom. The same awful conditions were transferred to the Spanish possessions in America. The vast system of government was set up on these lines from Florida to the Dakotas, everywhere characterized by cruelty. My own family went to Indian schools, which are nothing but Indian prisons. Winona's story tells you a little about it. In the Lakotas, the Catholic churches went in there and they pretty much raped and pillaged and controlled. The occupation of Florida by the Spanish and had every appearance of success. For 115 years, Spain and the Spanish missionaries had exclusive possession of Florida. It was during this period that those imposing results were achieved. In 1680, now we're going all the way back to 1680, a settlement of Scotch Presbyterians at Port Royal in South Carolina seemed to be a menace to the Spanish domination. It was wholly characteristic of the Spanish colony to seize by the sword at once and destroy its nearest Christian neighbor. It took the sword and perished by the sword. The War of the Races, thus inaugurated, went on in intervals of quiet until the Treaty of Paris in 1763, when Florida was transferred to the British Crown. No longer sustained by the terror of Spanish arms and by subsidies from the Spanish treasury. Now remember, all this time, all the Spanish gold and silver, they're coining the Spanish coins here, and they were shipping it back to Spain, and Spain was living luxuriously. They had a tremendous amount of wealth going into Spain. There was a tremendous amount of wealth. And all of it, and a lot of it was going to China. Because of China, that said that they had to take a wheelbarrow in China. It said it took a wheelbarrow of coins, and they had circles in the middle of them, and they put them on a round big heavy cord or string or wire, and they carry this with you to buy something. Now in China, and I'm going into this because we're talking about world history here also. We're not just talking about America. We're talking about what is feeding the Spanish power. The Spanish power was fed by when they went down into Montezuma and all of that down through there when they killed all those people and took all that gold back to Spain. Mm-hmm. They talked them into going out there and meeting with them, and then they murdered them. But this was okay because they did it for the crown, the Spanish crown, and the Spanish crown was Catholicism. They took all of this money and they were feeding all of this, and they were supplying and paying for all these ships, and then Spain and France and England began to have wars in the sea, and they were robbing ships. And back when we have Queen Elizabeth now, Henry VIII's daughter, she gets Sir Francis Drake, which was a pirate, and they go out and they start fighting, and finally they destroyed the Spanish Armada, which came to Spain and was going to establish the Catholic Church instead of the Church of England. And we had Bloody Mary that tried to establish in England. That was another one of Henry's daughters. Bloody Mary tried to establish the Catholic Church and killed everybody there that wasn't a Catholic. Bloody Mary. We have all of these revolutions in these nations overseas, but they're all being fed by the money, the silver and gold, and the food that's coming out of the Americas. It's quite a story, isn't it? In 1680, the establishment of Scots Presbyterians. When the Spaniards left Florida, the English found little to possess but the country. The whole number of its inhabitants, says Bancroft, men, women, and children and servants, was 3,000, and these, the men, were nearly all in the pay of the Catholic king. Possession, now how are they getting paid? By the silver and gold that's coming from the mines where they enslaved the Indians. Down in Mount Potosi, read the history of Mount Potosi. Down in Mount Potosi, they send these Indians down in these mines. The mountain was almost pure silver. And they used mercury to separate the gold and the precious metals and the mercury, the arsenic in the mercury. These people went down in these mines, and when they came out 8 or 10 or 12, 16 hours later, they shook, and they never quit shaking from the mercury poisoning. When they buried them in their graves, they said when their bodies rotted that there would be a pool of mercury that their bodies had absorbed. They were skinny, their teeth fell out, they went blind, they shook with tremors tremendously. That was the life of the Spanish slaves, the people that Catholicism had enslaved. The possession of it had cost nearly $230,000 annually, and now, as a compensation for the Havana, he made over to England the territory which occasioned this fruitless expanse. America should have taken over Cuba a long time ago. Almost within the skin of your teeth, America almost possessed Cuba over and over and over and over again. Most of the people received from the Spanish treasury indemnity for their losses and migrated to Cuba, taking with them the bones of their saints and the ashes of their distinguished dead, and leaving in St. Augustine their houses of stone and even the graves without occupants. The same thing happened in New Mexico. And all the West Louisiana and part of Mississippi came under the same dominion. Remember the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas O'Gorman of the Catholic University of Washington recounts the extraordinary successes and failures of the Spanish regime. He said over 100,000 of the Aborigines were brought to the knowledge of Christianity, slavery, and introduced, if not into the palace, or at least into the antechamber of civilization. It was a glorious work, and a recital of it impresses us by vastness and success of the toil, except they died in labor. They worked them to death. Yet as we look around today, we can find nothing of it that remains of the names of the saints and melodious Spanish stand out from maps and all of that section of the Spanish monk trod, toiled, and died, and few thousand Christian Indians, descendants of those converted and civilized, still survive in New Mexico and Arizona, and that is all. Remember, when the State Plains of America, that was the Spanish. When they went across the State Plains, they put stakes in the ground so they could follow their way back. They started out down there in Mississippi and Alabama with the Chickasaw Nation. They went in there and stayed all winter in 1539 and 40. And they went in there and stayed all winter one time with the Chickasaw Indians. The Indians fed them. And then when spring came, they wanted to enslave the Chickasaw warriors as carriers. And that didn't work. It didn't work very well. Anyway, he ran Coronado and his men off, killed a bunch of them, and spread the hogs all over the South. The Spanish carried herds of hogs with them to feed them on the way. They drove herds of hogs where they went for food. And they spread those wild hogs all over the South, and that's where the Razorbacks of the South, with these giant hogs and the Razorback hogs, where they're killing them down there to this day. That's where they came from. It's when the Chickasaw Indians shooed those Spanish off and scattered their flocks, because the flocks of herds of those pigs and hogs were chewing up their corn crops all winter long. The Indians were very hospitable people, but by the time spring came, when they wanted to make slaves out of them like they had everybody else, it didn't work so well. So that's how the wild hogs got in the South. Another little piece of history. The French, in the most brilliant series of exploits, sought to occupy America. The large sums of money were used to subsidize their expedition, only defined to meet with failure. There was lots of money here, but the Spanish had control of all the mines. They were hauling tons of gold out on ships every day. Tons of gold and silver were going. Their system of colonization was not a success. There was a want of men and permanent population. There was a condition in Louisiana, such as Louisiana for more than half a century, says Bancroft. After the first attempt to colonize by La Salle, its population may have been 5,000 whites and half of that number of blacks. Remember, they were bringing black slaves over here now too, but they had a whole lot more Indian slaves than they ever had black slaves. There was a lot more Indian slaves in America than there ever were black slaves, because when they imported black slaves to America, they imported malaria. Malaria. There were mosquitoes here, but they didn't have the Vivex infection in them. It's infection in the gut of the mosquito, and that causes Trescian fever. And the Indians didn't survive, but the blacks survived because they were immune to it. So they had a lot of black slaves. If you invested in a black slave for $500, you got to keep him. If you just captured an Indian and turned him into a slave, he wouldn't last very long because he's going to die of malaria. And in the South, where these great plantations were, and they had these beautiful homes up on a hill, because the mosquitoes always go to the low side. They were up on the hill to keep the mosquito away, but so many of those plantations owners died still of malaria. Quadrimaculatus. Anopheles quadrimaculatus caused the death of more Indians than anything. Louis XIV had fostered it with pride and liberal expenditures, an opulent merchant famed for his successful enterprise, and assumed the direction the Company of the Mississippi, aided by boundless but transparent credit, had made it to the foundation of their hopes. And again, Fleury and Louis XV had sought to advance his fortunes. Priests and friars dispersed throughout the nations, from Biloxi to the Dakotas, propitiated the favor of the savages, but still the valley of Mississippi was a wilderness. All its patrons, though among them it counted kings and ministers of the state, had not accomplished for it in half a century a tithe of the prosperity which within the same period sprung naturally from the benevolence of William Penn to the peaceful settlers in Delaware. William Penn, we have Pennsylvania now, remember. Are you studying a little bit of American history and world history at the same time now? Mm-hmm. I never got to do this before, but I'm doing it now. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you understand what was going on in America, from the Spanish, the French, the English, and all of them persecuted the Baptists, and all of them persecuted the Quakers, and all of them persecuted the Indians. That's why by the time the Baptists got into the savage wilderness, the savages were really mad, because they'd been abused, they'd been enslaved, and been jerked around and tortured and killed. And they want none of it. They didn't want none of the white man's religion. And it was very hard to preach to them the gospel of love. the gospel of love without in slavery. It was hard to preach that. They didn't believe it. They believed the message, but they didn't believe the messengers. Simple as that. The gospel of Jesus Christ is that Jesus Christ came into this world to save sinners like you and me. That he died for us on the cross of Calvary. That he raised the third day forevermore. And that in grace we are saved through faith, and that's not of ourselves. It's a gift of God. You don't baptize babies to get them into heaven. You preach to adults, for they will repent of their sins and call upon God to save them. And you baptize them by immersion. And that's all in the Word. Our Father, we send this message out for your honor and glory. Thank you for all the blessings you give us in this life, and those that you've given us, the friendships and the love that we have throughout our lives, and for the experiences and love and the provision that you give to us. And help us to hold on to the liberties that we have today, because they were fought hard for. The world had never known anything but princes and paupers and slaves and masters. Please forgive us where we fail you. Forgive me where I fail you. In Jesus' name I pray.